Today, we're talking about steaks. No, not this kind of steaks. This is actually salmon. I had limited options in the freezer. I should probably put that back before it thaws. I remember that intro. Feels like it was only yesterday, even though it was like 10 months ago. I should really do something about that salmon. Today, we're talking about flashbacks. So I guess technically today we're talking about yesterday. Flashbacks are scenes that take place prior to the main timeline of the story. Otherwise, they'd be called flash forwards. Or maybe the main part of the story would be considered a flashback. These scenes are used to convey important moments in a character's backstory or to describe events that happened before the story started. Now, flashbacks have something of a poor reputation. A lot of readers dislike them outright, and you'll see lots of advice advocating for their careful use or even to not use flashbacks at all. By their very nature, flashbacks take a reader out of the story. When done poorly, this can be jarring, distracting, or confusing. Flashbacks also have a tendency to be boring. Now, this is not necessarily caused by the scenes themselves being boring, but rather because flashbacks take the reader out of a story they were already engaged in and forces them into something else. Now, all that might discourage you from writing flashbacks, but flashbacks still represent one of the best ways to get important backstory information across to the reader. Rather than avoiding flashbacks, you should focus on writing them well. So with that, here are some tips for writing flashbacks. Tip number 2, consider the length and location of your flashback. That's the location of the flashback within the story, not like the physical location. One of the most common complaints about flashbacks is that they go on for way too long. As we'll talk about later on, you want to make sure the content of the flashback is focused and concise. The longer a flashback goes on, the more time that the reader needs to spend away from the main story, and the harder it will be for them to get back into the main story when the time comes. At what point in the story you add flashbacks is also worth considering. There is some varying opinions about whether starting a story with a flashback is a good idea. I covered a lot of this in the prologue video a while ago. But at a minimum, I would say give the reader a chance to learn about your characters and get situated within your world of the main story before you start jumping back into flashbacks. Not only will this help ensure that the reader gets engaged with your main storyline, but it will also make any backstory elements elucidated by the flashback have more meaning because the reader will know more about your plot and characters. Remember, one of the main reasons to include flashbacks is they enable greater insight into important elements within the main story. If the reader has yet to engage with those elements, then the purpose of the flashback may not be as clear. Which is a nice segue back to tip number 1, make sure the flashback has a purpose. Did you see what I did there? We're in a flashback right now. The absolute worst kind of flashback, at least in my opinion, is one which doesn't actually reveal anything important or relevant. Why would you take the reader out of the story to show them something that doesn't ultimately matter? Every flashback should reveal something about a character, or perhaps relay an important event in the past that has an effect on the main plot. The events in the flashback should have consequences that have a ripple effect on the main plot. If a flashback doesn't do any of those things, then it can and likely should be cut. Even if your flashback has a purpose, you need to make sure that that purpose is clear to the reader. One common cause of this is having the purpose of the flashback buried in an overly long scene. As we talked about before, keeping flashbacks short is generally a good idea, and part of that is to make getting the point across easier by reducing the amount of scene that the reader needs to wade through. Another cause of a reader missing the purpose of a flashback is not situating that flashback in a good location in the story. Not only should the flashback have a purpose, but that purpose should be relevant to the events that are happening in the main story immediately around the flashback. Which is all a good segue to tip number 3, consider the style of your flashbacks. Broadly speaking, there are 2 general ways to insert a flashback. You can either include it as a separate scene, divided from the rest of the story with either a scene or a chapter break, or you can sort of insert it in situ without any break or separation from the rest of the story. Both approaches have their respective strengths. Separating a flashback into its own scene likely reduces the chance of a reader being confused about when the events are happening. It gives a clear start and stop point for the flashback, and you can do things like specify when the flashback takes place in the scene or a chapter heading. The downside of this approach is that separate scenes can slow down the pacing of the story. If there's a relevant piece of backstory that needs to be gotten across in the middle of an important or momentous event in the story, breaking away to a separate scene or even a separate chapter is going to mess up the pacing. This is arguably the best strength of the second approach. By having the content of the flashback directly in the scene, you don't run as much of a risk of breaking the pacing. The downside of that approach is reader confusion. You have to be very careful that the reader knows you are transitioning to a flashback and also when you are transitioning back out of the flashback. It also gets a little bit more complicated to describe when exactly a flashback is taking place. You'll often see these sorts of flashbacks written in italics to indicate that they are a flashback. The use of past perfect tense can also help here to really reinforce that this is in fact a flashback, that the events are happening before the events of the story. Obviously, the in situ flashbacks are better suited to very, very short flashbacks, whereas the separate scene or separate chapter would probably do better for longer flashbacks. Regardless of what method you choose, always be sure to test with your beta readers and critique partners that the transitions to the flashbacks are clear and that there is no confusion. Speaking of confusion, we've reached the confusion of this video. I mean conclusion. We've reached the conclusion. Sorry, I got concluded. I mean confused. So there you have it. I hope you will remember watching this video fondly in a few years, and that you look back on it feeling that the advice in it was useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos. Just think of them as flashbacks, and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.